Hello, everyone. My name's Gurpreet Narwan. I'm the economics correspondent at the Times newspaper. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning for what I hope will be an informative and productive conversation about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on some of the poorest people living in Britain today. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's annual report on the nature and scale of poverty has an added sense of urgency this year. A year in which the pandemic and its associated lockdowns shattered businesses, jobs, and livelihoods, and forced millions of people to turn to the state for financial support. Of course, not everyone has struggled. Many people have become better off as a result of the pandemic, particularly those who were able to continue working from home and who built up their savings as opportunities to shop and eat out evaporated. But if there's one thing that we do know about this pandemic, is that it has exacerbated inequalities, causing the most pain to lower income households and pushing many who were already struggling closer to poverty. Peter Matujic, who is Deputy Director of Evidence and Impact with the Foundation, will be outlining some of these findings in more detail shortly. But before I pass on to him, I think it's important to say that poverty and destitution are not sad but inevitable consequences of this crisis. The government has already shown that it can act boldly when forced to do so. And as Helen Barnard, Director of the Foundation, will explain shortly, it will have to act again to redesign the systems that trapped people in poverty in the first place and left them so vulnerable to the present crisis. I write about some of these issues as an economics journalist, but they are, of course, political questions. And I'm pleased to say that Stephen Crabb, MP for Preseli, Pembrokeshire, will also be sharing his thoughts on the current debates within the Conservative Party about poverty and the future of work and welfare. We will then have about 20 minutes for a short Q&A, so I would urge as many of you as possible to get involved. Just type your questions into the chat box and I will try and get through them. So with that out of the way, Peter, would you like to kick us off with your findings from the report?
Yeah, of course. If people can bear with me for just 20 seconds while I get the slides on, that would be brilliant. Thanks, everyone. And do let me know if there's any issues with the slides as we go through. So yeah, what I want to talk about is charting a course to solve poverty in the UK, and so that we can avoid another damaging decade. So I'm going to start by an overview of the key poverty trends, and then going to sort of briefly cover the key drivers of poverty, and then the recommendations, which Stephen and Helen will also give their views on. But I wanted to start by what do we mean by poverty? And this is when someone's resources, mainly their material resources, are well below what is needed to meet their minimum needs, including social participation. For this report, we mainly use relative low income after housing costs, i.e. someone's in poverty if their net income after deducting housing costs and adjusting for household size and composition is less than 60% of the middle person's income. So what was poverty like in 2018-19, which was the latest available official data? And so even before the coronavirus, which is when this data set covers, an unacceptable 14.5 million people in the UK were caught up in poverty. And it's illustrated on this slide as 21 in every 100 people were in poverty. And that's made up of 8.5 million working age adults, 4.2 million children, and 1.9 million pensioners who are all living precarious and insecure lives. Overall changes in the last 15 years have been really muted in these statistics, with broadly worsening trends for children and pensioners. Most worryingly, what we've seen in the last couple of years is incomes are falling in the middle and at the bottom of the income distribution, and are falling fastest at the bottom of the income distribution. So even before the pandemic, lower income families were finding that their incomes were falling. And that's why we're calling, and also we've seen that basically that incomes haven't grown for that group for the last 10 years, and that's why we're calling it a decade of deprivation. So I'm now going to go through some other groups and their poverty levels. So moving on to people in families containing a disabled person, and we can see that's higher than the 22 across the population. So 26 in every 100 ones of those people in those families are in poverty. And this is even when we include disability benefits that are designed actually to pay for extra costs of disability rather than to improve living standards as income, to be consistent with the official statistics. If you exclude those benefits from income, which we think is more appropriate, then it gets closer to 1 in 3 people in families containing a disabled person are in poverty. And it remains the case, just like last year's report, that half of people in poverty are either disabled themselves or live in a disabled household. So that's a story about disability. Looking about children pre-pandemic, 30 in every 100 children were in poverty, so much more than the overall population, and that's actually increased. So since 2012-13, this group has increased in poverty in terms of by 2.4 percentage points. So it used to be the case that if you took a random sort of 40 children in the population, 11 of them were in poverty. Now, sort of 6 years on, 12 of them are in poverty in 2018-19. So then I'm going to move on to quickly looking at poverty pre-pandemic for a variety of ethnic groups. So moving on to households, people in households headed by someone of Black ethnicity, we can see that 42 in every 100 people are in poverty in that group. And what's very, very sort of shocking about that statistic is that has barely changed over the last 25 years. So it's always been about 4 in 10 people in households headed by someone of Black ethnicity have been in poverty. Moving on to households headed by someone of Pakistani ethnicity, that's up to 46 in every 100. And then moving on to people in households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity, that's all the way up to 53 in every 100. So what that means is basically the majority of households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity are in poverty. And that's despite actually those trends have been downwards for 25 years. So even those really kind of shocking high levels represent a quarter of a century of improvements. So in the mid 1990s, 2 out of 3 people in households headed by someone of Pakistani ethnicity and over 8 in 10 people in households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity were in poverty. So yeah, there have been improvements over time. So I think the key question now is what's happened to poverty during the pandemic? And unfortunately, we just don't know at this point. So the precise impact of poverty, of coronavirus on poverty is unclear. Although what it is very clear is that it will worsen without clear actions from government. And as Gurpreet says, the government has done some really clear actions to date, but we think they need to do more. And we can also see differences in economic effects linked with existing disadvantages. So basically, as Gurpreet says, some of the groups that were sort of faring worse before the pandemic have been worse affected by the pandemic. And so this is leading to higher poverty rates in poorer areas, people working in certain low-paying sectors being more likely to hit by job losses. So whilst we can't say exactly what's happening to poverty in 2021, we can look at the sort of factors that are affecting it. So what's driving poverty upwards? Well, we can see that the labour market's been really battered by the coronavirus storm. So there's been higher unemployment and lower earnings. So that's sort of pulling poverty upwards. But we also see some sort of effects dragging it downwards. One positive effect and one sort of almost a consequence of the pandemic, not a good effect. So the good effect is the higher benefits and the further government support, like the coronavirus job retention scheme. But also we have a kind of almost a statistical effect dragging the statistics down, which is basically that everybody's incomes are falling, and so the kind of poverty line is moving downwards as well. And as you can see, we're not certain which one of these effects will sort of win out. But what we can say is that basically lots and lots of the support has a cliff edge, either at the end of March or at the end of April. And without that kind of countervailing force of the higher benefits and further government support, we do see poverty rising. And even during the pandemic, even though we can't say precisely what's happening to the overall poverty level, we do see very worrying impacts on different groups, which I'm going to outline in the rest of the slides. Our work also benefited from powerful insights from people with lived experience of living on a low income. We set up with their help a group called the Grassroots Poverty Action Group. And basically these are some of their quotes that really sort of informed our analysis, and there's 3 blogs that we published at the same time as our annual report, which I really urge you to read because they're really powerful and sort of bring the statistics to life. So the next bits of the presentation are me going through what's happening in terms of the coronavirus effect and poverty in terms of the world of work, social security and housing. So starting off with work. So in work poverty, where we're defining here as the proportion of workers who are in poverty, has risen in recent years and stood at almost 13% in 2018-19. This chart is another way of looking at it, in that it shows the number of workers in poverty over time, which we can see has steadily risen since 2000. Now, part of this is a really kind of positive effect of there being more jobs over this period and unemployment falling. So that's a positive effect. But it's still really worrying that despite all those jobs being created, quite a lot of them were not enough to take the people who were in those jobs out of poverty. And what you can also see is quite a lot of that rise is actually amongst full-time employees. So it's not just sort of low hours work. There's actually sort of people working full-time who are also, there's more and more of those jobs that aren't sort of guaranteeing people getting out of poverty. So there are some groups that are more likely to experience in-work poverty and have a harder time escaping poverty. So this depends on the sector where you're working, the number of hours you're doing and the hourly pay, the location, your gender, ethnicity and age, and also lots of barriers, including availability of childcare and availability of transport to get to sort of a wider labour market. These all determine whether someone's likely to be in poverty and also whether they're likely to be able to escape it through work. So moving on to sort of some of the sectors that were more likely to be in poverty pre-pandemic. So we can see the wholesale and retail sector and accommodation and food were already more likely to be in poverty pre-pandemic. And what we can see has happened during the pandemic is those sectors have been very badly hit. So accommodation and food is basically hotels and restaurants, which we know have been basically shut down sort of periodically throughout the whole of the pandemic. And then wholesale and retail, obviously some parts of the retail sector have been able to open throughout, but lots and lots of the retail sector have been closed during this period as well. In terms of regions and countries, London and Wales have the highest rates of in-work poverty, and Scotland, Northern Ireland and East Midlands have the lowest rates. There are also some very stark differences by ethnicity. So about 1 in 3 Bangladeshi and Pakistani workers are in poverty. And Andrea Barry, my colleague, is going to be publishing a blog on ethnicity and poverty on Monday, and we're hoping to hold a joint webinar with the Runnymede Trust at the end of February, looking at this in more detail. So can keep an eye on your emails to see what when that sort of places are available for that. Lone parents continue to have the highest in-work poverty rate of all the family types, while the couple without children have the lowest. That's because the factors trapping people in work poverty disproportionately affect single parents, as they're more likely to be women working in a low wage sector, underemployed, or restricted by childcare and transport. So what's happened to work during the pandemic? Well, what we see is basically rising unemployment and also rising ratio of claimants to vacancies. So obviously the vacancies have gone down and the number of claimants have gone up, which obviously means that the people who lose their jobs may find it very, very difficult to find another. And that's for the reasons we've already mentioned. So accommodation and food services has one of the lowest hourly pay rates of all sectors, and people work fewer hours on average, and has been really hard hit by the pandemic. The government has put in lots of good support system in place, so including the coronavirus job retention scheme and the self-employment equivalent. And those schemes have been enormously successful at preventing a rise in unemployment. So around 8 million or 25% of all employee jobs were placed on the scheme at its peak. And that's 3/4 of all eligible workers in the accommodation and food sector. So you can only imagine what the effect would have been without those schemes being in place. But despite all that, unemployment has still risen, and what we're worried about is a sort of coming wave of unemployment, and it's those workers that were already vulnerable to in-work poverty may actually lose their job and move out of work poverty. And what we've done is we've tried to look at the types of jobs that are more at risk, and those ones are sort of ones that involve lots of engagement with the public and so forth. And what we've seen is basically 4 in 10 jobs on the national minimum wage sort of have a high score on this coronavirus job risk index that we've constructed, but only 1% of jobs where someone's earning over £41,500 are at risk of unemployment. So there's definitely kind of the low paid are a lot more at risk of losing their jobs in the coming wave of unemployment. So we're really worried about that. And again, we think the government needs to sort of keep in mind those groups and make sure that they remain to be supported. And yeah, what you can see here from the actual graphs, basically, as I say, this is the ratio of claimants to vacancies. And you can see that Northern Ireland, Southern Scotland, some of the cities and some of the coastal regions are the sort of likely have seen the biggest increases in the number of vacancies, or the number of claimants per vacancy. So that's a really whistle-stop tour over the kind of labour markets before and during the pandemic. I now want to move on to the benefit system. And here we can see that basically rates of many working age benefits were falling pre-pandemic. There was obviously a lot of kind of one-off cuts as well, but this is just purely down to kind of decisions on how benefits, this chart shows just purely benefit decisions about uprating over time. So there was a period where benefits were uprated by just 1% a year, and that was below inflation. And then between 2016-17 and 2019-20, they weren't uprated at all. So they were frozen in cash terms, and obviously inflation was still going on whilst that was happening. And what's that meant is that benefits have lost about 9% of their 2010-11 value over that decade. So again, it's a decade of deprivation because people on benefits will have seen their incomes fall. And what you also see, basically to put that in stark terms, the last time until April 2020, when benefits actually risen with the same rate as inflation, was April 2012, so 8 years ago. Yeah, over this period as well, support for housing costs stopped being really linked to the housing costs themselves. So that would have also sort of stretched the budgets of people on benefits. And looking across all changes, these meant that over half of those who live in families who receive universal credit, housing benefit, or any of employment support allowance, job seekers allowance, or income support were in poverty even before coronavirus, as were almost about half of people who receive tax credits. So what we see is the social security system isn't protecting people sufficiently, leaving families at greater risk of being pulled deeper into poverty. And we also see that people on benefits tend to have higher levels of debt, lower levels of saving, and more likely to be really relying on borrowing and money to cover any unexpected bills or financial shortfall. That was the situation pre-pandemic. And what we're seeing during the pandemic is actually a massive rise in the number of people who are in receipt of universal credit, which is what this chart shows. So by August 2020, almost 4.6 million families were on universal credit, which has nearly doubled, an increase of nearly 90% from the start of the year. And you can see basically all family types have seen an acceleration. And that's, all of these newly claiming families, well, lots of these newly claiming families will be claiming because they've seen a drop in income, pulling them into or closer to poverty. Now, the government's made a range of benefit changes in response to the coronavirus. Biggest change is this £20 uplift in the standard allowance, the basic rate of universal credit and working tax credits, and also actually re-establishing the link of the local housing allowance to the actual rents in an area. And we really welcome both of those actions, which have really sort of, as I said on one of my earlier slides, really have sort of helped to stop the kind of rise in poverty. But there is a kind of huge cliff edge where, come the start of April, without further decisions, millions of families, 6.2 million families, would see £1,000 a year cut in their incomes, and many hundreds of thousands of families would be pulled into poverty. So about 500,000 more people being pulled into poverty as a result of taking away the uplift. And then there's other groups have been left behind. So I've spoke about universal credit and working tax credits receiving the kind of the lifeline of the £20 uplift, but lots of carers and disabled people are on employment and support allowance, income support, and other benefits have been left behind. And also there's other people who are on universal credit or working tax credits who haven't seen the benefit of this increase because they've been capped. They're subject to something called the benefit cap, which restricts the maximum amount of benefits they're able to receive. So yes, we think there's lots of action here, but certainly fundamentally we think that the government needs to retain the lifeline at the end of April, beyond the end of April, and make it permanent. So moving on to the housing sector. So the first thing is that the proportion of households in the private rented sector has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. So it was around 1 in 10 in 1998-99, and now it's 2 in 10 or 1 in 5 in 2018-19. And what we can see is that basically private renting is an expensive tenure, and so there's high rates of poverty in the private rented sector. So 1 in 3 private renters are in poverty. So as you can remember from the first slide, that's a lot higher than sort of the 22 in 100 that we saw across the population as a whole. And basically, why has the number of private renters increased? Well, because fewer households are renting social housing because that option is often unavailable, and fewer people are buying with a mortgage because they can't afford to. And basically, between 2010-11 and 2018-19, the number of homes built for social rent as a proportion of new homes. So it used to be in 2010-11, 1 in 3 new homes were for social rent, and now in the current latest data set in 2018-19, only 3% of homes were built for social rent. So if you imagine that's how many social housing houses that are needed to be built every year, this is how many were actually built in the latest available data. So you can see a massive shortfall in that statistic. And basically, we see in the private rented sector that the fact that there's rising costs and high costs and falling support from housing benefit has created a strong current pulling these types of people in these types of tenure further into poverty. And we can see from during the coronavirus that many families were struggling to pay their rents because of the level of housing benefit falls short of the actual rents that they're having to be paid. Oops. And what we also see is that renters are amongst the worst hit by the impact of the coronavirus. So before the coronavirus, around 35% of working private renters and 42% of working social renters worked in the hardest hit sectors, which you see on the screen, and that's a lot higher than those people buying with a mortgage. And we can also see they were more likely to be furloughed as well. So about a third of private renters and social renters were furloughed, which is much higher than those with buying with a mortgage. And so we do really welcome the re-establishment of the local housing allowance relationship to rents, because that actually does mean that the amount of benefits you're receiving is related to the rent payments that you're likely to be paying. But we don't think it addresses the causes of unaffordable housing. So we really do think that, as part of going forward, the government should think about building more social houses. But more broadly speaking, what do we need the coronavirus future to look like? So I know Helen's going to be talking a bit about that. But what we see from all these slides, that even before coronavirus, millions of people in our society were living precarious and insecure lives. And in many cases, the coronavirus has swept them deeper into poverty or into poverty. And I think there's going to be, millions of people who are experiencing a situation they haven't experienced before because of the pandemic. And so the government has actually, put in place lots and lots of good policies, but it's always been kind of really close to the wire, and with people sort of having to face a lot of uncertainty and stress. And so, we think that we need to think about what's the longer term solutions. How can this be sort of improved, in the longer term, and also build up the public will so people, think that tackling poverty is a critical issue. And so we think that should be part of the kind of levelling up agenda going forward, is to make sure that the pandemic recovery, a measure of its success is how it feels for those with the lowest incomes. So that concludes a really whistle-stop tour through the report. I urge you to read the report. There's lots and lots of other good stuff there. But yeah, thank you, and I'll hand over to the next panelist.
Thanks very much, Peter. I hope everybody found that as informative as I did. It's quite a neat way to kind of segue to Stephen, I suppose, as we're talking about, the levelling up agenda and how the government's going to approach that over the coming year. So, Stephen, would you mind sharing your thoughts with us?
Gurpreet, thank you very much, and thank you to JRF for inviting me to participate in this morning's event. I thought that was an incredibly insightful presentation from Peter. It's a very good report, typically of JRF. I think there's a mark of excellence that really runs through all of JRF's work, and particularly during this difficult year that we've been through. I think the voice that JRF has struck time and time again has just been, as I say, consistently excellent and, in my view, correct. So I'd like to use the next few minutes, if I may, Gurpreet, to reflect a bit on where I think we're at in the debate about poverty and welfare support within my own party, which is the party of government, specifically around some of the big issues that we're trying to grapple with around social protection during the COVID crisis, but beyond that, what should be the nature of social protection that we support, what is the sustainability around public finances, questions like that, but also some more immediate practical decisions that are coming up. And Peter's presentation alluded to it, specifically around decisions around universal credit uplift. So this is an incredibly timely moment for this report to come out. But first, before doing that, I'd like to just reflect a bit on why I've been taking a closer interest in this subject over the last year. And I previously did a stint at the Department of Work and Pensions 4 years ago or so. And I haven't spoken out a lot about welfare issues since then, but I've been prompted to do so by a few things. And first of all, anybody who's been in the Conservative Party in the last few years and has been out campaigning for votes would not have failed to notice the shift that's happened amongst voters and low-income voters towards my party. And you can debate about whether that's a short-term Brexit phenomenon or something longer-term going on amongst low-income voters. But it's meant that many of us in the Conservative Party have had to think again about what is it that we're saying to low-income voters and what is it that we're actually offering them, particularly come election time. And actually, I was invited to a JRF event just before the 2019 election, early autumn 2019, where they were specifically discussing that issue. And I hadn't done much with JRF in the past, but I was very, very impressed with the discussion that we had that day and the kind of questions that JRF, the personnel who were there in that discussion were trying to prompt from us as politicians, I think were just really, really important, as I say, about what is it that we are offering this new cohort of low-income voters that, for whatever reason, are persuadable by the Conservative Party. So then, of course, we had the election, and there was indeed that big shift, and many of us saw big increases in our majorities on the back of low-income voters' voting choices. And then we had the onset of the pandemic early last year, and as Peter and Gurpreet both alluded to in their remarks, it was very evident from very early on in the pandemic just how unequally the effects of the pandemic were falling on different sections of society, both unequal impacts in terms of the particular communities affected. So we know that from very early on, it had a much bigger effect on poorer coastal communities, ex-industrial towns, but also within different communities across society. Lockdown, if we're going to be frank about it, has been very good news for lots of middle-class families. Less day-to-day costs, ability to save more, and of course savings rates in the UK have gone up in the last year as a result of that. But for people who've had to carry on going out to work in low-income jobs with uncertain hours, the effects of the pandemic have been very, very severe. And that became very clear, I think, to all of us looking at our email inboxes in Parliament from early on in the pandemic. We could see the practical effect of that in our own constituencies. We could see local food banks telling us that they were seeing significantly increasing demand from within the community. And I think that's a picture that's common pretty much across the country. Our local job centres were telling us about an enormous surge in universal credit claims. And okay, furlough was incredibly important in propping up the labour market during the course of most of last year. But we did then start to see the increases in unemployment. And what I think particularly concerned me is that I felt that this COVID-related economic crisis was coinciding with some big changes going on in the labour market and actually helping to accelerate some of those. And my fear is that what this is going to crystallise is that we are moving into a period of significantly higher unemployment for this country after quite a long period of falling and historically low unemployment. So you can see more families experiencing unemployment in their lives and potentially experiencing it for longer periods. And of course, as all of you who work in the sector know, you can survive on benefits readily for a few days or a few weeks even. but the longer you're relying on benefits, the harder it becomes to survive. Eventually, it's not just about paying for food, it's about replacing clothes, it's paying for the car to get fixed, all of those things that just become very, very difficult when you're relying on benefits. So these were some of the things that I was observing in my role as a member of parliament. It also prompted me to reflect on some of the decisions I'd been part of when I was in government under David Cameron's, when he was Prime Minister, specifically decisions that we took around 2014, 2015 to effectively squeeze working age benefits. And that's what you've seen over the last 5 years. And one of the things that, looking back at what's happened and doing the research, one of the things that's driven rates of poverty in this country amongst working age people is the decisions that were taken to squeeze working age benefits. And then, of course, in this last year, we've also had the phenomenon of Marcus Rashford talking about food poverty. And that's been incredibly important for putting poverty centre stage in the political debate. Make no mistake about that. And it prompted me to write a short piece for the Times Red Box column last summer, which in fact, some of the people at JRF helped me with some thoughts around. And the title of the article was "Sooner or Later, My Party Will Have to Talk About Poverty." And I still think that's where we're at. And I don't really think that we're quite having the public debate that we need to about the nature of the problem and how we tackle it. And certainly, talking from a political point of view, we've not really got out ahead of this issue in terms of food poverty, which is why the Rashford argument keeps coming back around and back around. So we then come to specific decisions that we've taken around welfare support, and Peter's exactly right. I mean, the interventions from the government at the start of the pandemic last year were enormous. I mean, you look at any other country's response and what Britain did in terms of the furlough scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, increasing universal credit, all of that amounts to more than almost any other country comparable country that you can point to. And it's made a real difference. So the plan, though, and Peter is exactly right, the plan still is on paper that the government will reduce some of this support for the poorest people, specifically the universal credit uplift. And that's where the debate at the moment is, alongside food poverty, the general debate about poverty is crystallizing around this specific issue of universal credit, and potentially it's becoming quite a totemic issue. When I talk to colleagues of mine in the Conservative Party, you be honest, there's a mixture of views right now. So when I talk to people who agree with me that it should be retained and extended, they'll give you a variety of reasons why they've come to that view as well. They'll recognise that it has made a real difference during the pandemic. It's needed. They will also point to the fact that it represents a measure of fiscal stimulus at this time, because people on lower incomes will spend their additional money. It will go back into the economy. And that's not necessarily the case when you look at other parts of the welfare system, for example, with the state pension. Pensioners' savings have gone up a lot in the last year. People also recognise, and this is a point that I've tried to make in Parliament a few months ago, that there's something that feels wrong in principle about when you've increased money available to some of the poorest people in the country, to then say, right, we're now going to take that back from you. And it feels to me that that's wrong in principle. And there are a number of my colleagues who would agree with that. And then there are some of us who also recognise, as I said a few moments ago, that universal credit uplift is actually just partially restoring what was squeezed out of working age benefits over the last 5 years. And so it's kind of partly a corrective measure. The pushback from those who don't agree, and this weekend in particular, because there's going to be a debate about this in Parliament on Monday, there will be a lot of conversations going on amongst MPs and whips over the weekend about this. But the pushback from those who are more sceptical, they say that, well, the universal credit was supposed to be a temporary uplift. All temporary COVID-related spending should remain exactly that, temporary. So we absolutely avoid locking it in as a permanent measure. You will hear Conservatives worrying about the need to get public spending back to pre-pandemic spending ratios. So how do you get welfare spending back to that proportion of government spending which it was before the pandemic, and all the other elements? So that relates to the sustainability of public finances argument. You do also hear colleagues of mine in Parliament questioning whether the standard allowance uplift is the most effective thing for helping families, and particularly families with children who are in poverty. And you will hear people saying, well, isn't it the case that a lot of the new universal credit claimants are single people? Therefore, is it really the most effective way of helping families with children? And therefore, is there other ways that we could cut the pie? If this universal credit uplift costs between 6 and 9 billion, is there some way that we can use that money alternatively to better support families with children? And again, that links back to the food poverty argument that we've been having. You will also hear colleagues of mine express concern that the Conservative Party shouldn't be sucked into just defending a position of left-wing welfarism, and that the work is the best route out of poverty message that we've been pushing very hard in the last 5 or 6 years, and it is popular with voters, that we've got to somehow cling on to that, and that by agreeing to spend more on welfare permanently, we somehow diminish the value of that work as best message. And then there are these wider discussions going on. There are colleagues of mine who will talk about place-based solutions to poverty, and I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. There'll be other measures talked about in terms of supporting families that perhaps echo some of the old Troubled Families programme that we had under the coalition. People will talk about the need to provide better practical support, like budgeting skills for poorer family. And then most of all, you'll hear Conservatives talking about, actually what we need is a big focus on skills, retraining and jobs, and getting people, helping them, supporting them in the labour market to take advantage of job opportunities and increase their hours and increase the value of the wage that they can secure. So I hope that just gives a kind of brief, very kind of machine gun fast flavour of where I think we're at. I mean, what I'd hoped would emerge from the COVID crisis is I'd hoped a stronger cross-party political consensus on the need for stronger welfare in this country, and recognising that the welfare system is not a bad thing in any way at all, but it actually plays a really important role in helping families stay afloat, keeping them from falling into really hard destitution and deep poverty, and keeping families and people in a position where when circumstances improve, they can take advantage of those opportunities that are out there. People find it much harder to find work and progress in the labour market when they're in a position of financial crisis and financial anxiety. And so the welfare system, I think, rather than being the other side of the coin, as opposed to work, is actually part and parcel of the same discussion. A good welfare system helps support the good labour market, which supports good economic performance for our country. But as I say, that cross-party political consensus I don't think is there yet. I think there's a lot of work to be done, which is why I think the work of the JRF and a report like this today is so important. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I get the sense from the comments that you've made and Peter has made that this year is going to be a pretty defining one for your party. We have this cliff edge coming in April, where the end of the government's job retention schemes and that potential uplift to universal credit could give people their first real sense or taste of what it's like to live on benefits. And with unemployment expected to hit at about 7.5%, how the government handles that is going to be critical if we are to protect people who are living close to poverty and to prevent them from falling into poverty. Helen, I know you've been considering the kind of the future of this and looking to the future and the outlook and thinking about how we build back more strongly. So I guess it's a good time for you to share your thoughts with us as well.
Great, thank you very much. And yes, I think you're right, Gurpreet. This is going to be a year of big decisions for the government particularly. And obviously I absolutely agree with Stephen. One big decision is about keeping social security strong and particularly keeping the universal credit lifeline. But I think there are two other big decisions that we also need the government to take in order to redesign the systems that locked people in poverty pre-COVID and made us all much more financially vulnerable to the impact of the pandemic. So the first is that we need to have a good jobs recovery. So in previous recoveries, there was a real concentration on the quantity of jobs, on getting people back into any job. And what that led was to an unacceptable situation in the last few years where in-work poverty outstripped employment growth. So this time around, we need to avoid making that mistake. So that means we need to focus on creating good quality jobs. So that's partly about pay, but it's also about security, about having enough hours, about having the chance to keep training and progressing. And we need to equip both the newly unemployed and long-term unemployed to get those good quality jobs. The second big decision is around housing. So we had before the pandemic a rising tide of homelessness, and that was being driven in great degree by the lack of social homes, which Peter showed us so strongly in the presentation. Now we've had some very good, very fast action during the pandemic around homelessness. We've had the Everybody In initiative, we've had bans on evictions. But actually what we need to avoid is having a real resurgence in homelessness and evictions as soon as those measures expire. Now we know as part of the recovery, the government will be wanting to build houses. It's one of the best fast economic stimulus measures, so they're going to do it. What we think they need to do is make sure that a large portion of those are social homes. So that makes sense economically because you get all the benefits of any kind of house building in terms of jobs. But in addition to that, you get the benefit of, in the long term, cutting the housing benefit bill because people aren't having to keep up with very expensive private rents. And you turn back the tide of homelessness, so you avoid the costs that homelessness brings across particularly local authorities, as well as, of course, to individuals. It also is the right thing to do morally because we all believe that we want to live in a country where everyone has a safe, affordable home to live in. Now, taking those steps, I think will do more than help us recover from COVID. It will put us on a path to a stronger economy and to a more just society. And it means we can come out of this stronger, more ready to deal with future crises and giving everyone the chance to thrive, which is what I think we all here today want to see. I'll stop there because it'd be great to hear some questions and comments from our audience.
Thank you, Helen. I thought your point about making sure that we have a strong jobs recovery, one that focuses on making sure that people have well-paid jobs and that they're not in work poverty, is critical and is in stark contrast to the recovery that we saw after the financial crisis a decade ago, where we saw a big boom in jobs, but they weren't well-paid, high-quality jobs. I do wonder, though, that how confident are you that this will be a priority for the government at a time when we're trying to do anything we can to just incentivize employers to hire people? And is there a risk that if we create too many challenges for businesses, that we disincentivize them from hiring people at a time when unemployment is expected to soar so greatly? And there was a story in the FT last night which suggested that the business department is already looking at ways to dismantle some of the employment rights afforded to British workers under EU rules. Is that something that worries you?
So yes, it definitely worries me if the direction of travel is going to be to reduce rights, because both morally and socially, people having secure jobs and knowing what shifts they're going to have from week to week is absolutely vital. But actually, there is also one of the big problems that we were debating pre-COVID was the UK's productivity problem. The fact that our economy doesn't actually produce the value which similar economies do elsewhere. And there's been some really good work by Andy Haldane and others, which has shown that part of the productivity problem is about having too many insecure jobs at the bottom of the labour market, and the fact that employers have not tended to invest in workers. And so actually I think we have tried it. We've already tried a thing where we just pump money in and get any job back. And what we saw was actually it hampered our recovery, and it put us in an incredibly vulnerable position by the end of the decade. So I think that it would be, I really hope that there are people in the Treasury who will learn those lessons. And we've got, we know that there's going to be a lot of work on green jobs. We know we're going to have to put funding into things like social care. The government can make a choice to make sure we get the proper value for that public money by making sure it funds good quality jobs, because that will also do things like reduce pressure on the social security bill. It will reduce pressure on services, all of those things. So I think it does make economic sense, but you need to think slightly more long term perhaps than we have in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Skills, equipping people with the skills so that they can do jobs that are well paid and high quality jobs is going to be critical, and it will be important for UK's productivity, which has been dire over the past 10 years. I'm going to go over to the questions that we've had come in. You talked about the jobs recovery. We've talked about the benefit system. A big issue here is inflation. And although the environment seems like it's going to be price growth is going to be fairly weak over the coming years as a result of COVID, Sylvia D'Souza points out that we will have an added challenge, which is Brexit. Whatever the government says, food prices have started to rise. Those who were in poverty have been hit with the pandemic and will be hit hard again with Brexit. What are the solutions for these hits? What will be the long-term effects of this and Brexit?
Okay, Print, do you want me to have a first stab at that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think so. We already saw a bit of the Brexit effect in some of the operating. So there was a bit of a spike in inflation after the vote, and you can see that was sort of part of the reason why the gradient of that chart went down. So I think it points to the fact that you need to make sure that these benefits are uprated at least by prices, and also to think about, well, what prices are going up, and are there items that are more likely to be sort of essentials that are driving that inflation. So I think it's just being very, very mindful of that, and I think also just being very, very mindful, as Helen's already said, about sort of, are there any kind of effects on the labour market as well that sort of always make things a bit more precarious. So I think it really does make it important that benefits sort of keep up with those rising prices. Because if inflation's high, then any kind of freezes or less than inflation uprating will rapidly erode the value again of the benefits.
Thank you, Peter. I hope that answered your question, Sylvia. We've had another question come in, which is around lone parents and the challenges that they face when it comes to childcare. So the question is, lone parents used to be able to continue to claim benefits till their youngest child was 15, but now you have to start looking for paid work when your youngest is 13, which reflects the assumption that looking after young children is not work, despite the fact that your child under 10 also has to have someone looking after them all the time. Given the lack of affordable, good quality childcare and the shortage of well-paid, part-time paid work, lone parents are in an impossible situation. What changes do you think would help their situation? Helen, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah. So one of the things we've seen a lot in the last few years is for any given problem, lone parents often are right at the forefront of taking the brunt of it, and we've seen that in the pandemic as well. I think there's a number of things we need to think about. So one is the fact that so many lone parents, because they've got to work part-time or flexibly, they are restricted to lower paid local jobs, and that holds them back for many years, even when the children are grown up. So I think there should be a big ask of employers to open up the better quality, higher paid jobs to people who want to work flexibly and part-time, because there is a big set of potential candidates out there who are incredibly committed and skilled, and employers could do far more to open up better quality jobs for those people. I think the second thing is to think about particularly transport and childcare. So there's one example of somebody we talked to, so a mother who was single mother working as a carer in Telford, walking to and from work every day, several miles. To get a better quality job, she would have to get into Wolverhampton, but the bus fare, the train fare would wipe out the benefits of the higher pay. Now, these are things that are eminently fixable. So we need to make sure we have in every place transport systems that are tailored to get people from where they live to where they can do good jobs. We need to make sure that the cost of those, so if you look at bus fares, they went up massively in the years leading up to the end of the decade. And that hits people on low incomes who need to get those buses to work. And I think childcare is the other one. So we've had a childcare policy in this country for years, which has pumped money into the system, public money as well as private money, but has actually managed to achieve neither particularly good quality nor particular affordability for many people on low incomes. So I think we could make much better use of that public money. But the key thing is, within universal credit, we need people not to have to pay for childcare up front and claim it back, because that is a lump sum of money that most low-income single parents don't have. So we can change the system and how we use public money to focus it in on making sure people on low incomes can access good quality, affordable childcare. And I think that would do a massive amount to open up jobs and the ability to work for people and balance it with caring.
Just on your point about opening up jobs to parents, lone parents who obviously aren't able to travel far to take up better quality or better paid jobs. The shift to remote working, and I know this doesn't apply to all workers, because many, particularly those that are in lower paid jobs, tend to be in industries such as hospitality, such as retail, where your job is very much. Do you think that the shift towards remote working could be a real opportunity for single parents, in that it will allow them to get access to jobs that they can do from their living room in a way that they wouldn't have been able to travel to London before to do these jobs? Can you see any opportunities there?
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? One of the things anecdotally has been lots of people who had been told their jobs couldn't be done remotely and flexibly. It's been proven they can. So I think there's going to be a question about whether we can bake that in a positive way. But I think Stephen perhaps was going to come in on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I mean, that is the big shift that's happened in the labour market so far during the pandemic, and I don't think we're going back to a world where these city centre office blocks are just full of people 5 days a week. This is a permanent shift. It doesn't follow from that means automatically that we're moving to a world where there's so much more opportunity for working women and lone parents in particular. Other things need to happen as well. And Helen spoke about this a few moments ago. It's around flexibility. And there have been various attempts to try to inject more flexible working practices into the labour market in recent years, but there's been very, very low take up, even when people have the opportunity with their particular employer. There's been very, very low take up. Now the question, and I'm not sure that we know the answer just yet, is whether the combination of remote working with the measures that currently exist and any future measures that we can encourage around flexible working will be a game changer for women in the labour market, particularly single parents. And I hope so. Thank
you, Stephen. I guess a follow-up question for you, Stephen. We've had a question that's just come in which says, given the pressures that local governments are under at the moment, where do you think the biggest opportunities are for local councils to change and have a real impact on the numbers and experience of people living in poverty? And I guess this goes for local government, and it also goes for the national government as well, with the public finances, some saying getting out of control, with the debt rising, the deficit soaring to levels far above where it was in the run up to the financial crisis. So in the aftermath of the financial crisis, rather, how much scope do they have to be able to act on this issue?
It's a big challenge, isn't it? One of the things I do think, and I see this locally in Wales, where local government comes under Welsh government here, but I think the same challenges exist, that because local government has become so constrained over the recent decades. It's not something that's just happened in the last few years. It's been going on for 2 or 3 decades at least. Not all local authorities have been in a particularly strong place to play the kind of leadership role locally in terms of COVID response, but the kind of wider social protection discussion that I think that they could. And in my introductory remarks, I spoke about those colleagues of mine who talk about place-based solutions to poverty. Well, they will also talk about the need for a greater role for local authorities, and they will point to various examples of best practice. And again, when we were having the discussions, the rows around food poverty and vouchers and food boxes and that kind of thing, there were various examples in the press being pointed to of different local authorities doing it in slightly different ways, more effective ways. And as I say, there is this discussion going on about okay, we are spending tens of billions of pounds through the benefit system without seemingly being able to reduce levels of poverty, which remain stubbornly at the same levels they did over the last 10 years and more. So is there not an opportunity, therefore, to use that money slightly differently, more locally, to try to get solutions? It's a difficult one because it involves dividing up a pie, and it means taking money away from certain parts of the system, and there will be people who feel the pain from that. But my personal instinct on this is I do want to see local authorities playing a more constructive role locally because they have the more local knowledge.
Viv Sugar, chair of the Bevan Foundation, has a follow-up question for you, Stephen, which is specifically on Wales. What more do you think the Welsh Government could be doing to combat poverty, in particular, considering that it's a region that has suffered greatly as a result of the pandemic, more so than others, as Peter pointed out in his research?
Yeah, so Wales is an interesting case study because when I was growing up in the 1980s here, Wales had a reputation for being a place of high unemployment, and we talked a bit about the labour market today and the long-term drop to historically low levels of unemployment. Well, that saw a remarkable change in Wales. Wales no longer was a standout area of high unemployment. It became smack on the UK average and also shared in that jobs growth. But still with very persistently high levels of poverty. And in truth, the powers that Welsh Government have got are fairly limited. The budgets that they have available are fairly limited. The one thing that everyone's looking to in Wales at the moment is whether the new Shared Prosperity Fund, which will replace the EU structural funds, can those funds be deployed in a more effective way to provide solutions in communities for poverty. We've had 20 years of EU structural funding, and there are two sides of argument. One is that it didn't do an awful lot to change the poverty picture. The other side of the argument is if we hadn't had those funds, the picture would be a lot worse.
Thanks, Stephen. Helen and Peter, it's so important that when we put out research on topics like this, that we hear from real people behind the numbers and the figures that can often mask the lived real experience of being in poverty. We had a question come in which asked, in the research, during the course of the research for your report, did you find any signs of hope or any sort of local policy interventions that made you think that there are lessons that we could be learned from it? Either Peter or Helen, whoever chooses to come in.
Thanks, Brittany. Yes, I think that's it. So it's sort of, and I think also it was just we had the Grassroots Poverty Action Group, and it was a really powerful group. So there was sort of some people on that group who had sort of volunteered in their community and sort of following on their experience, and all of them really took a stand and took a lot of time out of really difficult lives to sort of to talk to us and to give their experience. And so I think there is really a lot of hope. And I think some of the kind of compassionate actions of the government, they said like the £20 a week had made a difference, but equally the taking it away would also make a really, really bad negative difference. So I think almost you do need to have those voices, but I think there certainly was like a lot of passion and wanting to change in that group.
And on the subject of hope, I think, looking back at 2020, it was, so much of it was about just tragedy and appalling experiences. But I think it also showed us, in a sense, some of the best of our nation. So at a community level, you saw people coming together to protect each other. We saw the government take, the furlough scheme, the uplift universal credit, some of the actions they took around homelessness. We saw our government actually, particularly in March, take some really fast, bold, compassionate action. And we've seen public understanding and public concern around poverty reach record highs. And also just recently, the public support for keeping the £20 in universal credit is really high. So I think, in a sense, if 2020 was about tragedy, I think 2021 needs to be about harnessing the good we can take out of that tragedy and keeping those values going, keeping that value of protecting each other and working together, making that the thread through our recovery. And that would, bring something positive out of such a terrible period in our history.
And I guess it's also been a year in which public attitudes towards the reality of poverty and the experience of poverty have changed quite dramatically. And we've seen that through campaigns, we've seen that through you know, just the simple facts of more people falling into unemployment and being forced to rely on the government for financial support. I'm aware that we've run out of time and we still have so many questions that weren't asked. But Helen, Peter and Stephen, thank you so much for your insights. I think, as you've made clear, any discussion about poverty in the UK, it can't just focus on this pandemic. There were problems that needed addressing before COVID, and the pandemic has simply exposed many of the issues that existed beforehand. Policymakers will have to be, Stephen, I hope you agree, open-minded and ambitious in their approach. So let's hope you've given them something to think about. To everyone tuning in, I'm sorry we couldn't get through every question, but please do feel free to get in touch either via email or Twitter to share your thoughts and perspectives on the conversation we've just had. We'll also be sending out the slides from Peter's presentation, so you will have that if you want to refer to it. But apart from that, thank you all for tuning in and goodbye.
Thank you very much for your chairing, Gurpreet. It's fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.